Hello everyone, this is Dr. Akanksha Jain, Faculty of Community Medicine at Hippocampus by Medici. Today I am going to discuss about all the recall questions of community medicine which occurred in AIIMS PG June 2020 examination. So let's begin. Here the first question is not true about the Ebola virus. First option, mosquito spread. Second option is community transmission through nosocomial route. Third one, filvovirus. Fourth one, men is the accidental dead end host. So the answer is mosquito spread, which is actually not true. So mosquito spread is not a true option of this Ebola virus. So let's learn few facts about the Ebola virus. So Ebola virus is a disease which was actually formerly called as Ebola hemorrhagic fever. It is a rare disease and it is often fatal illness in humans. So it's kind of a dangerous exotic disease. It first appeared in 1976 in two simultaneous outbreaks. So these two outbreaks occur in Nazara in South Sudan and second one occurred in Yambuku in DRC. So when it occurred in Yambuku, DRC, which is a small village near the Ebola river, the name occurred from there as Ebola virus. So this is the reason why this virus got its name. Now this Ebola virus belongs to the Filoviridae family, which also include other two genera. The other two genera are Cuva virus and Marburg virus. So these are the three genera of Filoviridae family. Ebola virus has its own natural host, which is fruit bat of the Pteropodidae family. Now this is actually the natural Ebola virus host. Going forward to learn more about the Ebola virus transmission, we need to understand that it spreads through human to human transmission via direct contact. So how does it occur? Direct contact occur when the broken skin or the mucous membrane comes in contact with any kind of body fluid or blood of the sick person or the person who have died of Ebola virus, or if this broken skin or mucous membrane comes in contact with any object which is infected or contaminated with the blood or body fluid or semen or feces or vomit, whatever, from a person sick with Ebola or the body of a person who died from the Ebola virus. So these are the routes of object of transmission or how Ebola is being transmitted from one person to another. The incubation period for Ebola virus is about 1 to 3 weeks. You can say 2 to 21 days. So it's actually a wide range of window period. So it's sometimes difficult to understand that it is a Ebola virus if the symptoms doesn't appear, and it may cause it can transmit from one person to another person during this period. Now in pregnant women who get Ebola virus and recover from the disease, they may still carry the virus in their breast milk. So it's actually very difficult, or it is not advisable to feed the baby, while the pregnant women who have been survived after Ebola infection or who became pregnant after they have recovered from the infection do not contain any risk of carrying their virus in their breast milk. So these are two different things. While pregnancy, if the virus occur, if the infection occur, there are chances that breast milk may contain virus. However, if the pregnancy occur after the Ebola virus infection or the person is recovered, then there are very low chances of having Ebola virus in the breast milk. Now here the standard diagnostic management is automated or semi-automated nucleic acid test. Talking about the vaccine of the Ebola virus, this RVSV-ZIBOV is the first FDA approved vaccine. This FDA approved vaccine had been approved in 2019 for Zaire Ebola virus. However, the first vaccine have already been discovered in 2016. So that vaccine was not actually FDA approved, but the first FDA approved vaccine occurred in 2019. So just remember the name of this vaccine, RVSV Zipo vaccine for the 2018 and 19 Ebola virus outbreak. Now coming to the next question, handling of viral specimen of SARS-CoV virus 2 require biosafety level 1, 2, 3 and 4. Now if we don't know the biosafety levels and what are the significance, we may not actually mark the correct answer. So here the correct answer is biosafety level 3, and we will discuss each and every biosafety level one by one. Let's have a look at this chart. Number 1, biosafety level is for those agents who are not known to be consistently cause any kind of disease. So standard microbiological practices are needed in biosafety level 1 agents, and no primary barriers are needed. For secondary barriers, only open bench top sink are required. Now, number 2, biosafety level 2 is needed for those agents who cause human disease hazards equals percutaneous injury, ingestion, mucous membrane exposure. So we can say the example could be HIV virus. So in biosafety level 2, you need to take all precautions or microbiological practices needed for biosafety level 1 plus limited access biohazard warning signs of sharps, that how to discard sharp properly, biosafety manual defining waste decontamination and medical surveillance policies should be mentioned there. Here the primary barriers or containments should be done for manipulation of the agents that cause splashes or aerosols of the infectious material, which is actually must as it may cause transmission of virus from one person to another. Here the PPE or lab personal protective equipment is needed, which includes lab coats, gloves, face protection as needed. And for secondary barrier, the first thing, top sink is required along with the autoclave is must. Biosafety level 3 is needed for all those indigenous or exotic infection which may or may not cause serious kind of lethal consequences but are transmitted by aerosols. So they have potential risk of transmission by aerosols and they might have very lethal consequences. So biosafety level 2 microbiological practices are needed along with decontamination of all waste and lab clothing before laundering, and baseline serum is needed. For safety equipment or primary barriers, all the class 1 and class 2 biosafety levels and biocontainments or other physical containments for all manipulations are needed, and PPE is needed, protective clothing, gloves, respiratory protection is must here as aerosols are highly potential source of infection. So here the secondary barriers: physical separation from corridors, self-closing double door access, exhausted air not circulated, and negative airflow in the laboratory is must. For biosafety level 4 is needed for those dangerous and exotic agents which have very high risk of life-threatening diseases and they have aerosol transmitted infection or related agents with unknown risk of transmission also, we need biosafety level 4. So here all kind of biosafety level 3 measures of biological practices are needed along with clothing change before entering, shower on exit, and all material decontaminated on exit is essential. For primary barrier, all procedures in class 3 biosafety containment or class 1 or class 2 biosafety containment in combination with full body air supplied positive pressure personal suit is needed. So here positive pressure personal suit is needed in biosafety level 4 primary barrier. Along with that, for secondary barrier, there should be a separate building or isolated zone, dedicated supply, exhaust should be there, vacuum, decon system and other requirements are must here. So these are various kind of biosafety level 4, and for COVID, this biosafety level 3 is needed as it may or may not have very serious lethal consequences sometimes but not always. the mode of transmission is by aerosol transmission. So the correct answer is biosafety level 3. Now next question. Identify the vector in the given disease cycle or life cycle. The first option is heart tick, next is soft tick, third is louse, fourth is trombiculid mite. Here you can see that there is egg, larval stage, protonym stage, deuteronym stage and tritonym stage, and then adults. This cycle belongs to the trombiculid mite. Now trombiculid mite or mites, let's learn something about those mites. So the mites are usually the size of 0.5 to 2 millimeter. So these are the size of trombiculid mite, and this part, head, neck and body is not separated, head, thorax or abdomen, no separation is there. So adult is actually a single body having 1, 2, 3, 4, you can count it, 8-legged. So these mites have potential to cause a very important disease known as scrub typhus. The vector of the scrub typhus, which is caused by R. susugumusi. So this is the causative agent from the scrub typhus, having the symptoms like fever, chills and rigor, lymphadenopathy, and the most important thing which is actually should be taken care of or should be given attention to is formation of eschar. Now what is this eschar is? It's a hard blackened scab formation in this disease, wherever the mite had actually sucked the blood. Hard blackened scab formation. So by this eschar, this disease can be identified. So the trombiculid mite can be responsible for the disease scrub typhus, and the treatment for the same would be tetracycline, which is a drug of choice in the scrub typhus. In trombiculid mite, the other hosts on which the mite survives are rats or mice. So these all stages survives on various hosts. The larval stage, then protonym stage, then deuteronym stage, then tritonym stage, and adult survives on either rats or mice or humans. So in humans, we have already seen that it causes scrub typhus. So this is all about the trombiculid mite. Let's have a look on the life cycle of heart tick. Here you need to understand that heart tick contain 3 hosts in their whole life cycle. When the eggs are laid in the soil, then after hatching in the environment, larva appeared from the egg which got stuck or which survive in its first host. The larval part is actually 6-legged part or 6-leg formation of the body. So this feeds on the host for a few days, then it converts into the nymphal stage. The nymphal stage again finds a host on which it feeds. It is the 8-legged stage. Again, the nymphal stage converts into the adult part, and adult needs to find another host. It can be dog or human being. So here the 3 hosts can be rat or mice or dog and humans. So these are the hosts on which the tick survives, and it sucks the blood for around 30 minutes, the adult one, and it can survive for around 1 to 10 years. So this is the life cycle of heart tick. Now what are the diseases which are caused by the heart tick? So the various diseases which are caused by heart tick are: first, tick-borne relapsing fever. Now another disease is Rocky Mountain spotted fever, Q fever, Lyme's disease, and sometimes it may also cause tick-borne viral encephalitis, which is actually difficult to diagnose. So these are the diseases which are caused by ticks. So actually you might be knowing about the two types of tick, hard tick and soft tick. The major differences about their body, that the soft tick has softer upper part of the body, while hard tick is having the hard part of the body. So here is the life cycle of the louse, which is actually Pediculus humanus capitis we are talking about. So this is the egg which is usually laid on the hair shaft. After 6 to 7 days, young louse hatches. So egg converts basically directly into the nymphal stage. After that nymphal stage, first mold occur in 2 days after hatching, second mold occur after 5 days of hatching. However, the third mold occur in 10 days of hatching. After these 3 molds, the adult louse is developed. Now, male and female louse is having a slightly difference in their body. Female louse is actually longer than the male louse. Now, after this reproduction between the female and male louse, the first female lays eggs 2 days after the mating. Now, after that, she lays 4 to 8 eggs and then dies. This is the life cycle of the louse. So what are the diseases which is caused by louse? So louse actually act as a vector for those disease. So first one is relapsing fever. Second one is epidemic typhus. Third one is trench fever. Now epidemic typhus is a disease which is caused by Rickettsia prowazaki. In epidemic typhus, the symptoms which occurs are usually headache, chills, fever and body ache. It is considered to be a highly fatal disease. About 10 to 40% of the people or cases who are not being treated can actually die because of this disease. So the treatment of choice is tetracycline in epidemic typhus. The next one is trench fever. Here the trench fever, it is caused by Rhocamalacia quintana. You need to remember this. Here also the symptoms are body aches and pains and fever. So the drug of choice here also is tetracycline. Another drug which can be given is doxycycline or chloramphenicol. So in trench fever, it doesn't usually occur in India. The most common places are Ethiopia or Nigeria. So these are the places where it occurred. Now the third disease which is caused by louse is relapsing fever, which is caused by the Borrelia recurrentis. So Borrelia recurrentis, which lives on or has host louse as a host, causes relapsing fever in which the fever occurs for 2 to 9 days. And this usually occurs because when the lice is got crushed between the fingernails. So it is the third disease which is caused by various kinds of organism. However, the host is common, which is louse. So talking about the head louse, how to get rid of it is, one can use 1% permethrin or pyrethroids can be used to get rid of the louse. So this is all about louse which we need to learn and which can actually help solving many kinds of questions here. So let's move on to another question. Now in a woman to calculate RDA, recommended daily allowance with parameters are used. Option 1, 1.73 meter height. Option B, 55 kg weight. Option C, 10 hours of work, or option D, 18 to 30 years of age group. So the correct option here is 55 kg of weight. Now let's go through what are the standard reference Indian men and women for these criteria of RDA. So in men and women, the age should be 18 to 29 years, and for women also it is 18 to 29 years, which is a standard age taken. For weight, the weight for men is 60 kg, however, for weight for women was 55 kg, which was actually the correct option in our question. Height is 1.73 meter in males, however in females it is 1.61 meter. Activity level in males and females are somewhat similar on each working day. Males and females should at least be engaged in 8 hours of occupation, which usually involves moderate activity. 8 hours in bed, 4 to 6 hours sitting around, and 2 hours of walking is needed. So this is standard reference Indian men and women. So these are the criteria you need to learn. Next question. Dose of IV tablet for adolescent girls of Anemia Mukt Bharat. Options are 60 mg of elemental iron and 500 microgram of folic acid daily once, 60 mg of elemental iron and 500 microgram of folic acid weekly once, 100 mg of elemental iron and 100 microgram of folic acid daily once, 100 mg of elemental iron and 100 microgram of folic acid weekly once. So if you know about the Anemia Mukt Bharat, you will actually definitely going to mark it correctly. So the answer here is 60 mg of elemental iron and 500 microgram of folic acid weekly. Anemia Mukt Bharat is actually a centrally sponsored scheme which has targeted to be completed by 2022. So here the target is for children aged 60 to 59 months. For anemia, 58%, which was in 2016, should be reduced to 40% in 2022. Adolescent anemia cases should be reduced to 11%. Adolescent girls 15 to 19 years anemia cases should be reduced to 36% by 2022. Women of reproductive age group, the anemia should be reduced to 35% among them in 2022. Pregnant women with anemia should be reduced to 32% in 2022, and lactating women with anemia should be reduced to 40% by 2022. So these are the targets of Anemia Mukt Bharat by 2022. Now who are the beneficiaries of Anemia Mukt Bharat? Talking about the target, we have already known about the beneficiaries, who are the beneficiaries, but talking about the numbers of those beneficiaries, so there are 124 million children with age 6 to 59 months who are actually the beneficiaries in this scheme. There are 134 school-aged children of 5 to 9 years of age who are the beneficiaries of this scheme. 47 million of adolescent boys of 10 to 19 years of age who are beneficiaries. 68 million adolescent females. 17 million women of reproductive age group. 30 million of pregnant women and 27 million of lactating women. So these are the beneficiaries in the Anemia Mukt Bharat who are eligible for this scheme. Now Anemia Mukt Bharat has these kind of provisions given in their scheme. First one is prophylactic iron and folic acid supplementation. Second one is deworming. Third one is intensified year-round behavior change communication campaign, including ensuring delayed cord clamping in newborn, testing of anemia using digital methods and point of care treatment, mandatory provision of iron and folic acid fortified food in government funded health programs, addressing non-nutritional causes of anemia in endemic pocket with special focus on malaria, hemoglobinopathy and fluorosis. As our question is related to the prophylactic iron and folic acid supplementation, we are going to read about it and little bit about the deworming. So, Anemia Mukt Bharat having prophylactic dose and regimen for iron folic acid supplementation contains age group of 6 to 59 months children. So, here bi-weekly 1 ml iron and folic acid syrup should be given. The iron and folic acid content in them will be 20 milligram of elemental iron and 100 microgram of folic acid. For the children of 5 to 9 years of age, weekly iron and folic acid tablets should be given, having 45 milligram of elemental iron and 400 microgram of folic acid, sugar coated and pink in color. School-going adolescent girls and boys, that is 10 to 19 years of age, should be given weekly 1 iron and folic acid supplementation having 60 milligram of elemental iron and 500 microgram of folic acid, which is the part of our question, and the color of the tablet will be blue. For women with reproductive age group, the dose should be weekly 1 iron folic acid tablet, each tablet containing 60 milligram of elemental iron and 500 microgram of folic acid supplementation. Here the tablet color is red. And for pregnant woman and lactating mother, daily 1 iron folic acid tablet starting from 4th month of pregnancy should be given, that is from the 2nd trimester, and throughout the pregnancy for 180 days it should be given, and continued postpartum having 60 milligram of elemental iron and 500 microgram of folic acid, and this tablet should also be of red color. So the pink color tablets are for children of 5 to 9 years of age, blue color tablet for adolescent children, and red color tablet for pregnant and lactating women, and also the women of reproductive age group. So this is about the prophylactic dose and regimen for iron and folic acid supplementation in Anemia Mukt Bharat. Talking about the dose and regimen for the deworming, for children aged 6 to 59 months of age, biannual dose of 400 milligram of albendazole should be given, that is half tablet to children 12 to 24 months and 1 tablet to children of aged 24 to 59 months of age. For those children who are above 5 years of age, that is 5 to 9 years, biannual dose of 400 milligram albendazole, that is 1 tablet should be given. School-going adolescent boys and girls should be given biannual dose of 400 milligram albendazole, 1 tablet, similar to the previous one. Women of the reproductive age group, biannual dose of 400 milligram albendazole, that is 1 tablet again. And pregnant women and lactating women of 0 to 6 months, 1 dose of 400 milligram of albendazole after first trimester, preferably during the 2nd trimester should be given. So this is the dose and regimen for the deworming. Next question. While taking the blood sample of HIV positive symptomatic patient, a resident doctor picks up needle stick injury. Which of the following is the best post-exposure prophylaxis of HIV due to needle prick injury? First, zidovudine plus lamivudine. Second, zidovudine, lamivudine and nevirapine. Third option, tenofovir, lamivudine and lopinavir. Fourth option, zidovudine, nevirapine and stavudine. So the answer here is tenofovir, lamivudine and lopinavir. Let's have a look about the post-exposure prophylaxis. Now the eligibility for the post-exposure prophylaxis should be offered as early as possible if anyone is having any kind of needle stick injury to all individuals who have been exposed by various means, or the mucous membrane came in contact with the fluid of any kind of infected person. So ideally it should be started within 72 hours of the exposure. And assessment for the eligibility should be based on the HIV status of the source whenever possible, and may include consideration of the background prevalence and local epidemiological pattern, which is actually essential so as to know the viral load in the epidemiology or the surroundings. Here the post-exposure prophylaxis who does not require post-exposure prophylaxis are the person who are already HIV positive, or when the source is established to be HIV negative, then PEP is not needed. Or exposure to body fluid that do not pose a significant risk, like if there is exposure of tear or non-blood stained saliva, urine and sweat, then there is no need of post-exposure prophylaxis. But when it is needed is parental or mucous membrane exposure, that is sexual exposure, splashes to the eye, nose or the oral cavity, then PEP is needed. Or the following body fluid may pose a risk of HIV infection like blood, blood-stained saliva, breast milk, genital secretion, CSF, cerebrospinal fluid, amniotic, rectal and peritoneal, synovial, pericardial or pleural fluid. So these are the various types of types of body fluids which are responsible for the transmission of virus and may pose a risk of having HIV infection. So it needs PEP, that is post-exposure prophylaxis. This is the criteria. So actually for post-exposure prophylaxis, 2 drugs are sufficient, but basically 3 are preferred to make it more efficient. In adults and adolescents, tenofovir and lamivudine combination is essential, and the preferred third drug is lopinavir or esdonavir. Alternative options are these efavirenz or veltinavir. For children less than 10 years of age, these are the preferred drugs, that is cidovudine and lamivudine, or for that again lamivudine or tenofovir is given. And the third preferred drug is lopinavir, again is the preferred drug for children too. The frequency should be 28 days, that is for 28 days continuously these drugs should be prescribed for post-exposure prophylaxis. Next question, which of the following is not included in the sentinel surveillance of the HIV? Antenatal women, STD clinic attendees, single migrants, long distance truckers. So the answer is STD clinic. Talking about the sentinel surveillance of any disease is essential to understand or to get to know about the hidden cases, or whatever hidden cases are there, they are actually came out because of sentinel surveillance for which it is needed. So HIV sentinel surveillance plays a crucial role in monitoring the level and trend of the HIV epidemic across different population group and locations in the country. So sentinel surveillance is must to understand the actual condition or situation of that disease in an area. So around 650 districts covered under HIV sentinel surveillance in India has one of the widest networks of the sites. So this is actually tracked biannually, and thus the data is being collected for the sentinel surveillance, filling up the normal data. Technical support for the training, monitoring and supervision is provided by 2 national and 6 regional institutes to ensure high quality implementation. So what are the actually sentinel surveillance sites or high risk group among it? So female sex workers, men having sex with men, injection drug users, transgender people, single male migrants and long distance truckers. So these are among the high risk group and bridge population for which the HIV sentinel surveillance is being implemented or being done. Which of the following infection necessitate airborne restriction to stop spread of airborne droplet infection? Measles, influenza, diphtheria, pertussis. It is a kind of tricky question as airborne droplet infection occurs in all those 4 of the diseases. But the answer here is measles. Why the measles here is the answer is, measles is very contagious and infectious disease with secondary infection rate of about 90%. Thus, when it creates aerosol, so there are very large chances of transmission of infection from one person to another, and majority of the person remain contagious from 1 to 2 days before the onset of symptom, which is actually also a dangerous thing, because if the symptoms doesn't occur and we don't know about the disease, it may even transmit the infection in that stage also. Immunocompromised individuals are also remain contagious throughout the illness. However, in influenza, patient may remain infectious even before they have symptoms, just like measles, but it is not as infectious as measles. So here you need to mark the measles as the answer. Next question is, which of these is possible use of serum antibody testing in patient affected with COVID-19? To know the duration of the disease, to identify previous infection in asymptomatic patient, to quantify viral load of the patient, or to identify the type of antigen responsible for the disease. So serum antibody testing does not help in finding the duration of the disease. We are just assessing the IgG or IgM antibody inside the person. So whenever the antigen is being entered, it had developed IgM antibody and later on IgG antibody. So it is actually suppose or says that the infection already occurred. So the next answer to identify previous infection asymptomatic patient would be the right answer. It cannot help in quantifying viral load of the patient as we are not assessing the agent factor, we are assessing the antibody. It cannot help in identifying the type of antigen responsible for the disease. Next question is, what should be the minimum dose of tetanus antitoxin in the body to provide optimal protection? Greater than 0.1 international unit per ml, greater than 0.01 international unit per ml, greater than 0.001 international unit per ml, or greater than 5 IU per ml. So the answer here is 0.01 IU per ml. Talking about the tetanus prevention, so it is best prevented by the active immunization with tetanus toxoid, and it ensures the protection level only if we give it in the dose of 0.01 international unit per ml in serum. So if it is the level of the tetanus antitoxin or tetanus toxoid in the serum throughout the life, you are protected against the tetanus. So all persons regardless of the age should be immunized for the tetanus. Thus, tetanus prevention can occur in two forms, with the combined vaccine and second one monovalent vaccine. Monovalent vaccines are plain on fluid toxoid, or tetanus vaccine absorb PTAP or APT. These are the types of tetanus vaccine. However, the passive immunization in tetanus occurs by the human tetanus hyperimmunoglobulin in the dose of 250 international unit or equine antitoxin in the dose of 1500 international unit. So this is about the active and passive immunization of tetanus. Next question is formula for maternal mortality ratio. So we are talking about the mortality ratio. First, total number of maternal death upon total number of live births into 1000. Total number of maternal death upon total number of pregnant women into 1 lakh. Total number of maternal death upon total number of live births into 1 lakh. Total number of maternal death or total number of women in reproductive age group into 1 lakh. So the answer here is 1 lakh. We'll learn a bit more about it. First of all, we need to understand what are the indicators of maternal and child health care. First is maternal mortality ratio, which we have read already. Mortality in infancy and childhood, this is also an indicator. So there are various indicators in this, like perinatal mortality rate, neonatal mortality rate, post-neonatal mortality rate, infant mortality rate, 1 to 4 year mortality rate, under 5 mortality rate, and child survival rate. So if the question comes about the indicator of MCH care, you need to answer all these things. MMR and these all mortality rate indicates the MCH care. So about maternal mortality ratio, the numerator contains total number of female deaths due to complication of pregnancy or childbirth or within 42 hours of delivery from puerperal causes in an area during a given year, divided by total number of live births in the same area and same year into 1000 or 1 lakh, mostly 1 lakh it is used. So that will be the right answer for maternal mortality ratio. You need to understand that the denominator will always contain the live births and numerator will contain all the females who have died during pregnancy or childbirth or within 42 hours of the delivery. Other definitions are pregnancy related death, in which the death of a woman while pregnant or within 42 days of termination of pregnancy, irrespective of the cause of death, is the pregnancy related death. Maternal mortality rate contains number of maternal death in a given period per 1 lakh women of reproductive age group. So denominator here will be reproductive age group, not the live birth. So that is the difference between maternal mortality ratio and maternal mortality rate. Adult lifetime risk of maternal death. The probability of dying from maternal causes during women's reproductive lifespan. So this is the adult lifetime risk of maternal deaths. Proportion of maternal deaths of women in reproductive age group, number of maternal death in a given time period, divided by total death, that is of women of reproductive age group, that is 15 to 49 years. So this is the definition of proportion of maternal deaths of women of reproductive age group. Next question. Diphtheria vaccine is which type of vaccine? For getting this answer, you need to understand or you need to learn various types of vaccine. The options are live vaccine, killed vaccine, toxoid and polysaccharide. Diphtheria is a toxoid vaccine, and here is a chart by which you can understand the various types of vaccine. So first one is live vaccine. What are the vaccine which comes under the live vaccine are BCG, yellow fever, OPV, measles, mumps, rubella, typhoid, varicella, rotavirus, cholera. So these all are the live vaccines. So the live vaccines are usually contraindicated in any kind of immunocompromised person or in pregnancy. Inactivated or killed vaccine are typhoid, cholera. Cholera is also there. So there are two types of vaccine in cholera, which are live vaccine and killed vaccine. In typhoid also, there is live vaccine and killed vaccine. Then pertussis, influenza, polio, rabies and Japanese encephalitis. These are inactivated or killed vaccine. Then there comes the subunit vaccine, where the part of the antigen is used for the formation of vaccine. This is known as subunit vaccine. So there is toxoid vaccine, which have diphtheria, tetanus, anthrax, pertussis and influenza. Next comes the polysaccharide vaccine. So there is pneumococcus, meningococcus, H. influenzae B and typhoid vaccine. These are polysaccharide vaccine. Then comes the glycoconjugate, which is also a part of subunit vaccine. So the vaccine comes in it are HIV, pneumonia and MenACWY. So these are the vaccine which comes under glycoconjugate vaccine. Another type of vaccine under subunit vaccine is recombinant vaccine. So here HPV, Lyme's disease, cholera toxin B and HPV vaccine, these are all recombinant vaccine. Then comes the combined vaccine. So this is the chart you need to understand to give answer to such kind of questions, and you can then easily answer any question which comes. Next question. Which of the following is the non-parametric test? Student t-test, ANOVA test, Pearson correlation test or Friedman test? So the answer here is Friedman test. For that you need to understand what is parametric test and non-parametric test. Parametric tests are those tests which assumes that underlying statistical distribution in the data are following the normal distribution curve. Therefore, several conditions of validity must be met in the parametric test. So these parametric tests are reliable tests which we usually use. For example, student t-test is a kind of parametric test for two independent samples is reliable only if each sample follow a normal distribution curve or the variances in the sample are homogeneous. However, non-parametric tests, it do not rely on any kind of distribution and they does not need to actually meet any kind of validity measures. So these are the non-parametric tests. Let me give you an examples of parametric and non-parametric tests. So unpaired t-test, paired sample t-test, one-way ANOVA, factorial DOE with a factor and blocking variable. Just remember these. These are all the parametric tests of means. However, non-parametric tests of medians are sample sign test, Wilcoxon sign rank test, Mann-Whitney U test, Kruskal-Wallis Moods median test, Friedman test. So these are non-parametric tests of the median. So these are the parametric examples of parametric and non-parametric tests you need to understand. Let's talk about the next question. Glasgow Coma scale is A. Nominal scale, B. Ordinal scale, C. Metric scale and D. Alphanumeric scale. So the answer here is it's a kind of ordinal scale. Let's learn about it one by one. What is nominal data? What is ordinal data? So nominal data are used to level variances without any quantitative value. Or we can say if we are naming anything or we are giving any particular type of name to anyone, male or female, or we are just giving a tag to someone or something, then it is nominal data. We cannot measure it actually. We cannot measure hair color. We cannot measure male and female. So there is actually the names of the people and nationalities or something like that comes under nominal data. However, ordinal data, order of the variables is must in the ordinal data, as the name suggests itself. For example, how likely are you to recommend our services to the friends? So there are options: very likely, likely, neutral, unlikely, very unlikely. So there is actually one order of the answer. With this order runs from very likely to very unlikely, step by step. So this is ordinal data. In interval data, interval scales are numeric scales which we both the order and the exact differences we know about it. The classic example of interval scale is the Celsius temperature, because the difference between each value is the same. For example, difference between the 60 and 50 degree is measurable 10 degree, as is the difference between 80 and 70 degree. The basic fact in interval data is they do not have true zero. The true zero does not exist in interval data. However, in ratio data, they tell us about the order, they tell us the exact value between the units, and they also have absolute zero, which allows for wide range of both descriptive and inferential statistics to be applied. So ratio scale do have such kind of data having true zero. So height or weight comes under this. Alright, so this is the ratio data. Now our option Glasgow-Coma scale. So Glasgow-Coma scale is a brain injury or level of neurological injury which is classified according to the Glasgow-Coma scale, having mild Glasgow-Coma scale level less than or equal to 8, moderate if GCS value is 9 to 12, and severe it is greater than 12. So you can see there is order of the data: mild, moderate and severe. Thus Glasgow-Coma scale comes under the ordinal data. It includes assessments of the movement, speech and eye opening, talking about the Glasgow-Coma scale. But here we are just talking about what type of data it is, then it is ordinal data. Next question. Nikshay Poshak Yojana is diet counseling, midday meal every day, rupees 500 per month financial benefit, or rupees 500 per week financial benefit. The answer is 500 per month financial benefit. Now, talking about the Nikshay Poshak Yojana. So, Ministry of Health and Family Welfare, Government of India has announced this scheme for basically for the patient of tuberculosis, so as to make them more healthy and more compatible with the treatment. And this scheme, which was called as Nikshay Poshak Yojana, is a financial scheme for the TB patient. So, all TB notified patients are beneficiaries of the scheme. Financial incentive of rupees 500 per month for each notified TB patient for the duration for which the patient is on anti-TB treatment should be given. So it can be 6 months, it can be 8 months, it can be 18 months, whatever would be the duration of the treatment. Accordingly, this financial incentive will be given to the patient. The scheme is registered under direct benefit transfer. So incentive can be distribution in cash only via direct benefit transfer, preferably through Aadhaar enabled bank account or in-kind service. So the funding of a scheme is centrally sponsored scheme. The funding is under the National Health Mission. Financial norms of National Health Mission are being followed in this in terms of cost sharing. And for pediatric TB patient, those who are not having any kind of bank account, money shall be deposited in the accounts of parents or guardians in Nikshay Poshak Yojana. Or the patient for not having any kind of bank account or Aadhaar number, health staff will facilitate opening of bank account for the patient, preferably under Jan Dhan Yojana, and will also facilitate his or her Aadhaar enrollment. So that is the work of health staff. So here Aadhaar number is essential for any kind of financial benefit getting from the Nikshay Poshak Yojana. The financial benefit is being given under this strategy. The first incentive is being given on the notification of the disease. Second incentive is being given in 6 months treatment at 2 months of follow-up, that is at the end of intensive phase follow-up result. For the treatment of 8 months in a patient, the second incentive is being given at the 3 months. However, in 24 months of the duration treatment, the second incentive is being given at 2 months of the follow-up result. Talking about the third incentive, it is being given at 6 months for the 6-month duration treatment, at the 5 months, at 8 months duration treatment, and 4 months on the follow-up result for 24 months of treatment. Fourth incentive is not applicable for those having 6 months of treatment. It is applicable for those having 8 months of treatment. So after end of the 8 months, this fourth incentive is being provided to the patient. For 24 months of regimen, at the end of 6 months of follow-up result, this incentive is being given. For subsequent incentive, every 2 months, this 1,000 rupees is being given for every 2 months, that is 500 per month is being given for 24 months. Exception handling for 6 months patient, for each extension of treatment, 1,000 rupees for 2 months, or if extension is only for 1 month, then 500 rupees per month is being provided. For 8 months of patient, again for each extension of treatment, rupees 1,000 for 2 months is being given, or 500 rupees per month being given for 1 month of extension. And similarly for 24 months of regimen, for each extension of treatment, 1,000 for 2 months, or if extension is only for 1 month, rupees 500 per month is being given. So this is the financial regimen which is being provided under the Nikshay Poshak Yojana. Next question. Pacemaker from cardiac wing of hospital is discarded in red bag, blue cardboard box, yellow bag, or puncture proof box. So the answer is blue cardboard box. Let's have a look about the various kinds of various colored of bags and what are the things which are being discarded in those bags. So yellow bins or yellow bags are used for post-operative body parts, placenta, plaster of Paris, pathological waste, cotton waste, dressing materials, beddings, body fluid, face mask, caps, cytotoxic and microbiological, biotechnology, lab waste. For red waste, what are the things which should be discarded are syringe without needle, IV set, catheter, gloves, urine bag, dialysis kit and IV bottles. Or we can say most of the things which are recyclable, you need to understand this, recyclable things are being discarded in red bag, R for R. So you can remember that by this. Now white, all sharps are discarded in white. So here needles, syringes, blades and scalpels are being discarded in white bin. Now in blue, glass, everything which is made up of glass are being discarded in blue, and all the metals are discarded in blue bins. So broken glass, ampules and lab slides are being discarded in blue bins. Metals like nails, metallic body implants, so we were talking about this pacemaker is also a metallic body implant. So it is being discarded in blue cardboard box, and scissors. So these are the four category of biomedical waste segregation, having yellow, red, white and blue bins. So here you can either say that it is being discarded in blue bins, or you can say that blue cardboard boxes with blue colored marking are used for discarding the glassware or metallic body implant. How they are being treated? For each and every boxes or each and every waste from these boxes, first from yellow bin, incineration of plasma, pyrolysis or deep burial is needed. For red one, auto, micro or hydro, and then sent for recycling. Autoclaving is needed, hydroclaving is needed, then sent for recycling, or it should not be sent to landfill. So I have already told you all those materials which are recyclable are considered in red bag, are discarded in red bin. So talking about the white, including sharp metals, so they should be treated as autoclaving or dry heat sterilization, followed by shredding or mutilation or encapsulation. So this is how we treat the things in the white bins or white bags. For blue one, containing glassware or metallic implant, disinfection or autoclaving, microclaving or hydrolysis, and they are then sent for recycling. So this is how we used to treat each and every object in various kinds of bins as per the biomedical waste rule. Next question is similar to the previous one. As per the biomedical waste management guidelines, latex gloves are discarded into option A, red bag, B, blue bag, C, yellow bag, and D, white bag. So I'll show you the similar chart. So answer here is red bag. So the chart, I've already told you that the recyclable products or recyclable discarded material are being discarded in red bag. So gloves here are being discarded in red bin. So that is our answer. And I've already explained about other colored bags or bins. Next question. Disease not screened under RBSK or Rashtriya Bal Swasth Karyakram are vitamin A deficiency, congenital glaucoma, congenital cataract, and retinopathy of prematurity. So the answer here is congenital glaucoma. To know this answer, you need to understand what are the diseases which are being actually screened in RBSK, Rashtriya Bal Swasth Karyakram. So it is here RBSK, you need to learn that it is actually a program which was used to identify an early intervention for the children from birth to 18 years of age for any kind of disease of 4 Ds, including defect at birth, what are the deficiencies, developmental delays, and disability. So these are the 4 Ds which are being covered under RBSK, Rashtriya Bal Swasth Karyakram. So what are the defects and deficiencies, disease and developmental delays which are being covered under RBSK? So it is given here: defects, neural tube defect, Down syndrome, cleft lip, telophase or clubfoot, developmental dysplasia. Our option congenital cataract is right here. So this comes under defect at birth. Now talking about the deficiency, what are the deficiencies which are being screened in RBSK are anemia, vitamin A, vitamin D, and severe acute malnutrition and goiter. So our option vitamin A deficiency is here. Diseases of the childhood, talking about the disease of childhood, skin condition, otitis media, rheumatic fever, reactive airway disease, dental condition, convulsive disorder. So these are the disease of childhood. Here retinopathy of prematurity is also there, which is our option. So these 3 are the options which are being screened under RBSK program, while our 4th option, that is congenital glaucoma, does not include in this RBSK program. So here are some developmental delays and disabilities which are being screened under RBSK, having vision impairment, hearing impairment, motor delay, cognitive delay, language delay, behavioral disorder, autism, learning disorder, ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. And the one here is congenital hypothyroidism, also included in this RBSK program. Next question. All are helpful in COVID-19 prevention or disinfection except option 1, 70% ethanol, option 2, 1% glutaraldehyde, option C, hand washing, and option D, use of mask. So the answer is 1% glutaraldehyde. As we have already known or read a lot about COVID-19 prevention, so this is just actually a revision about the hygiene or precautions in COVID-19. So hand hygiene is must. You might have already learnt a lot about it during these days. So hand hygiene includes either cleansing hands with alcohol-based hand rubs, which contain at least 70% of alcohol, or with soap and water, and disposable towels should be used to dry your hand. Alcohol-based hand rubs products are preferred if the hands are not visibly soiled, and wash hand with soap and water when they are visibly soiled. For at least 20 seconds it is recommended. Use the appropriate technique and duration for performing hand washing or hand rubbing. For respiratory hygiene, there are some questions. Ensure that the following respiratory hygienic measures should be covered or used. First, cover nose and mouth with a tissue or a bent elbow while coughing or sneezing. You should not use your palms, or it will actually reinfect the person, or it will infect other objects. Perform hand hygiene after contact with respiratory secretions or objects. that may be potentially contaminated with respiratory secretions. So you need to actually perform hand hygiene again and again. And patient having suspected COVID-19 should have a medical mask to wear. So this is the respiratory hygiene measure which should be followed by either the patient or a normal person. Now next question. Interns had a prick from positive hepatitis B patient. Anti-HBs value were 91 milli international unit per liter of intern while patient was HBsAg positive. What should be the next line of management? 1 dose of HBIg and revaccination as soon as possible. B. 1 dose of hepatitis B vaccine. C. 1 dose of hepatitis immunoglobulin and 1 dose of hepatitis B vaccine. Or no post-exposure HPV management is necessary here. So the answer is no post-exposure HPV management is necessary. Why this is so? Because the person with anti-HBs concentration greater than 10 milli international unit per ml are classified as protected against HPV. So here we were having 91 milli international unit per ml in the intern. So it is not essential for the intern to take any kind of vaccine. While those with the value of less than 10 are required to undergo a vaccine booster dose. Individual continuing to have anti-HB concentration less than 10 even after the booster dose should be offered 2 additional vaccine doses. Suppose after one booster dose, if the level is still less than 10, then again 2 doses are must after this. And they should be retested. Only with subject having titer less than 10 after 2 complete vaccination will be considered as non-responders. If they are still having less than 10 milli international unit per ml of this titer, then they will be considered as non-responders to HBV vaccine, or we can say they are resistant to it. Now next question. Severe acute malnutrition criteria are all except mid-arm circumference less than 115 mm, weight for age below 3 standard deviation, weight for height below 3 standard deviation, or bipedal edema. So the answer here is weight for age below 3 standard deviation. So let's discuss it in short. So what is moderate acute malnutrition? It is defined as weight for height Z score between -2 and -3, or mid upper arm circumference between 115 mm and less than 125. That is, range is between 115 to 125. So this is moderate acute malnutrition. However, severe acute malnutrition, the criteria are weight for height score is less than 3 standard deviation, mid upper arm circumference is less than 115 mm, or the presence of bipedal edema. So these were the 3 options which were being given in the question, while the 4th option, that is weight for age criteria, is not present here. So there is no weight for age criteria for defining severe acute malnutrition. What is global acute malnutrition? It refers to the moderate and severe acute malnutrition together, and it is used as a measurement for the nutrition status of the population. So it is actually indicator of any kind of emergency situation related to the nutrition. Talking about the merismus and Kwashiorkor, let's have a few words about it. So these are the historical terms which were being used for the type of severe acute malnutrition. Now term severe acute malnutrition is being used. If the question comes from this merismus and Kwashiorkor, you need to know that merismus refers to children who are very thin for their height and they meet the weight for height and MUSE cutoff, but they do not have bilateral pitting edema. While in Kwashiorkor, it refers to the edematous malnutrition. That means they will be having bilateral pitting edema. But these 2 terms are actually obsolete and being discarded, and the latest term severe acute malnutrition has replaced these terms. So these were the questions which had been recalled from the AIIMS June 2020 of community medicine.